Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other kids in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their weekends at the mall or playing video games, she could be found at her grandfather's ranch, learning to shoot tin cans off fence posts with an old rifle that had seen better days. The rifle belonged to her late grandfather, a World War II veteran who had taught her everything about marksmanship before he passed away 3 years ago. It was a weathered Winchester Model 70 from 1952, with a scratched wooden stock and metal parts that showed their age through patches of rust and wear. The scope mounted on top was equally ancient, a basic 4x magnification sight that her grandfather had installed himself decades ago. Most people who saw the rifle would shake their heads and suggest it belonged in a museum rather than on a shooting range. The local gun enthusiasts at Murphy's Sporting Goods often chuckled when Sarah walked in with the old weapon, making jokes about antiques and suggesting she upgrade to something modern. Even her own father had offered multiple times to buy her a new rifle with all the latest features. But Sarah had a special connection to that old rifle. She knew every quirk, every slight pull to the left, every way the trigger felt under different weather conditions. Her grandfather had spent countless hours teaching her not just how to shoot, but how to truly understand her weapon. He used to say that a good marksman could hit a target with any rifle, but a great marksman knew their rifle like they knew their own heartbeat. Now 18 years old and fresh out of high school, Sarah worked part-time at the local hardware store while saving money for college. She still spent her free time practicing at the makeshift range her grandfather had built behind the ranch house. Her grandmother, Rosa, would often bring her lemonade and watch from the porch as Sarah sent bullet after bullet into targets at distances that impressed even the most experienced hunters in town. The annual Lone Star shooting championship was approaching, and for the first time Sarah had decided to enter. The competition attracted marksmen from across the state, with cash prizes that could help pay for her college tuition. When she mentioned her plans at the hardware store, her boss Jim Rodriguez raised his eyebrows skeptically. "You sure about that old rifle, Sarah? These competitions get pretty serious. Folks bring equipment worth more than most people's cars," he warned, though his tone was gentle and concerned rather than mocking. Sarah simply smiled and continued stocking shelves. She had made up her mind, and nothing anyone said would change it. That evening, she spent extra time cleaning and preparing her grandfather's rifle, running her hands over the familiar scratches and dents that told the story of decades of use. Her grandmother found her in the garage, carefully adjusting the scope with tools that were almost as old as the rifle itself. "Mija, you know that rifle better than anyone," Rosa said softly. "Your abuelo would be proud to see you carrying on his tradition." As Sarah looked through the scope one more time, checking the alignment, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice reminding her of the fundamentals: breathing stance, sight picture, trigger control. The basics never changed, regardless of how fancy or expensive the equipment might be. The registration deadline for the competition was tomorrow, and Sarah had already filled out the paperwork. She knew she would face skepticism and probably outright laughter when people saw her show up with the old Winchester. But she also knew something that the critics didn't understand. This wasn't just about the rifle or the scope or any piece of equipment. It was about the countless hours of practice, the deep understanding that came from true dedication, and the unshakable confidence that her grandfather had helped her build. That night, Sarah dreamed of the competition, imagining herself on the firing line with her grandfather's spirit guiding every shot. She could already hear the whispers and see the amused glances from other competitors. But she also felt a calm certainty that surprised even her. Whatever happened at the Lone Star Championship, she would represent her grandfather's memory with pride and skill that went far deeper than the surface appearance of her equipment. The morning of registration arrived with typical Texas heat, even though it was barely 8 o'clock. Sarah loaded her grandfather's rifle case into the back of her grandmother's old pickup truck, along with a small cooler of water and the homemade sandwiches Rosa had insisted on packing. The Lone Star shooting range was located about an hour outside of town, and as Sarah drove through the gates, she felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. The parking lot was already filling up with expensive trucks and SUVs, many pulling trailers loaded with professional shooting equipment that probably cost more than Sarah had made in the entire past year. Walking toward the registration table, Sarah noticed the other competitors unpacking their gear. She saw custom rifles with space-age-looking stocks, scopes that appeared to have more technology than NASA satellites, and shooting rests that looked like they belonged in a laboratory rather than on a firing range. Men and women in matching shooting jackets and pants moved around with the confident efficiency of people who did this for a living. At the registration table, a middle-aged man with a clipboard looked up as Sarah approached. His name tag read Dave Wilson, Match Director. When Sarah handed over her completed paperwork and entry fee, Dave glanced at the basic information she had filled out. "First time at our competition?" he asked, not unkindly. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Well, welcome. You'll be shooting in the open division with everyone else. The course of fire is explained in your packet, but basically we'll have targets at 100, 200, and 300 yards. Best combined score wins." Dave handed her a competitor number to pin on her shirt and pointed toward the equipment inspection area. As Sarah walked toward the inspection station, she passed a group of competitors who were discussing the technical specifications of their rifles in language that sounded like a foreign dialect of engineering terms. One man was explaining how his custom barrel had been cryo-treated and hand-lapped, while another debated the merits of different bullet weights for long-range accuracy. "Excuse me?" Sarah said politely to the equipment inspector, a woman wearing an official championship shirt. "I need to get my rifle checked in." The inspector, whose name tag read Linda Chen, smiled professionally and gestured to the inspection table. When Sarah opened her case and lifted out the old Winchester, Linda's expression shifted slightly. She tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but Sarah could see the woman struggling not to react to the obvious age and worn condition of the rifle. "Well, this is certainly a classic," Linda said diplomatically, checking the action and looking through the bore with a small flashlight. "Everything appears to be in safe working order. The scope is properly mounted and secure." Behind Sarah, she could hear whispered conversations that weren't quite quiet enough to miss entirely. Phrases like antique and museum piece drifted over, along with what sounded like barely suppressed chuckles. One voice that carried a bit too far commented about bringing a horse to a car race. Linda finished her inspection and handed Sarah a small sticker to place on her rifle case, indicating it had passed safety check. "Good luck out there," she said, and Sarah detected a note of genuine encouragement in her voice that suggested Linda had seen plenty of expensive equipment in the hands of shooters who couldn't use it effectively. Sarah found a spot at one of the preparation tables and began to unpack her gear. Compared to the elaborate setups around her, her equipment looked almost comically simple. She had her grandfather's rifle, a basic shooting mat that had seen countless range sessions, a small bag of ammunition she had carefully hand-loaded herself, and a notebook where she had written down all the environmental conditions and adjustments her grandfather had taught her to consider. At the table next to her, a man in his 40s was assembling what looked like a precision instrument rather than a rifle. His scope alone probably cost more than Sarah's truck. He glanced over at her setup and did a double-take when he saw the old Winchester. "That's quite a vintage piece you have there," he said, not entirely unkindly but with obvious skepticism. "My grandfather had one similar to that. Great for hunting deer, but these modern competitions are pretty demanding." "It's served me well so far," Sarah replied simply, continuing to prepare her ammunition and check her notebook for the range conditions. The man introduced himself as Michael Torres, explaining that he had been competing in precision rifle matches for over a decade. His equipment represented years of upgrades and refinements, each component selected to provide every possible advantage in accuracy and consistency. "What kind of groups does that old rifle shoot?" Michael asked, genuine curiosity overcoming his initial skepticism. "Depends on the day and conditions, but usually under an inch at 100 yards when I do my part," Sarah answered honestly. Michael nodded, clearly trying to be polite while probably thinking that sub-inch accuracy wouldn't be nearly enough to compete with the level of precision these modern rifles were capable of achieving. He wished her luck and returned to his methodical preparation routine. As Sarah finished preparing her gear, she noticed a figure approaching her table. It was Captain James Mitchell, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s wearing a military veteran's cap. She had noticed him earlier because something about his bearing and the respectful way other competitors greeted him suggested he was someone important in the shooting. "Community. Mind if I take a look at that rifle, young lady?" Captain Mitchell asked politely. Sarah nodded and carefully handed over the Winchester. The captain examined it with the practiced eye of someone who truly understood firearms, not just as equipment but as tools with history and character. Winchester Model 70, pre-1964 action, he said appreciatively. Your grandfather's rifle? Yes, sir. He taught me to shoot with it. Captain Mitchell looked through the scope, worked the bolt action, and handed the rifle back with a slight smile. That's a shooter's rifle right there. I've seen plenty of expensive equipment in the hands of people who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. And I've seen miracles performed with rifles that looked like they belonged in a scrapyard. He paused and looked directly at Sarah. Equipment doesn't make the marksman makes the equipment. Don't let anyone tell you different. As the captain walked away, Sarah felt a surge of confidence that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with honoring the legacy of the man who had taught her that precision came from the heart and mind, not from a price tag. The competitors gathered around the match director for the safety briefing and course of fire explanation. Sarah found herself standing near the back of the group, still drawing occasional glances and whispered comments about her equipment. She tried to focus on Dave Wilson's instructions, but it was hard to ignore the buzz of conversation around her. The first stage will be at 100 yards, Dave announced. 10 shots for score, 15 minutes time limit. We'll move to 200 yards for the second stage, same format. The final stage at 300 yards will separate the serious competitors from the recreational shooters. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd at this comment, and Sarah noticed several people glancing in her direction. She kept her expression neutral and continued listening to the instructions, making mental notes about wind conditions and the way the heat was already creating mirage effects downrange. Sighting shots are allowed at each distance, but they count against your time limit. Choose your shots wisely, Dave continued. We'll start with firing point assignments. Competitors will rotate through in groups of 10. Sarah was assigned to the third group, which gave her time to observe the first 20 shooters and get a feel for how the day was progressing. She found a spot where she could watch the firing line and began to study the conditions more carefully. The wind was light but variable, switching direction every few minutes in a pattern that reminded her of the conditions her grandfather had taught her to read at the ranch. The temperature was climbing steadily, which would affect both the ammunition performance and the mirage that was already beginning to dance above the target frames. The first group of shooters took their positions at the 100-yard line. These were clearly experienced competitors who moved with practiced efficiency, setting up their equipment and getting into position with smooth, rehearsed movements. Their rifles were uniformly modern and expensive, mounted on adjustable rests that allowed for precise positioning. Sarah watched as the first shots rang out across the range. The electronic scoring system immediately displayed results on monitors visible to spectators. Most of the scores were impressive, with several shooters managing groups that measured less than half an inch center to center. Behind her, she could hear Michael Torres talking with another competitor. The conditions are actually pretty good for this early in the day. That little wind shift might catch some people off guard, but it's nothing too tricky. Yeah, but wait until we get to 300 yards, his companion replied. That's where the equipment really starts to matter. Those long shots will show the difference between a real precision rifle and something meant for hunting. Sarah pretended not to hear the comment, but she made a mental note about the wind patterns she had observed. Her grandfather had taught her to read conditions not just with instruments, but with her eyes and instincts developed through countless hours of practice in varying weather. The second group took their turn, and the results were similarly impressive. Sarah began to understand that she was competing against people who had invested not just money, but years of dedicated practice into this sport. The casual dismissal of her equipment was starting to seem less about snobbery and more about genuine surprise that someone would attempt this level of competition with such basic carne. When the third group was called to the firing line, Sarah gathered her equipment and walked forward with 9 other competitors. She was assigned to firing point number 7, right in the middle of the line. As she began setting up her shooting mat and unpacking her rifle, she was acutely aware of the other shooters around her completing their elaborate setup routines. To her left, a woman was adjusting what appeared to be a computerized scope that displayed information on a small screen. To her right, a young man was consulting a smartphone app that apparently calculated ballistic solutions based on current atmospheric conditions. Sarah laid her grandfather's rifle on the simple bipod she had attached to the front sling swivel, adjusted her shooting mat, and settled into the prone position that felt as natural to her as walking. She opened her notebook and reviewed the notes she had made while watching the previous group shoot. "Shooters, you may load and commence firing when ready," Dave announced over the public address system. 15 minutes on the clock, starting now." The firing line erupted in activity as shooters began their sighting shots. Sarah took her time, settling into position and letting her breathing slow down to the rhythm her grandfather had taught her. She ignored the rapid fire of shots around her and focused on the fundamentals that had been drilled into her since she was old enough to hold a rifle safely. Her first sighting shot felt perfect as it left the barrel. Through her grandfather's old scope, she could see the bullet hole appear in the 8 ring slightly to the right of center. She made a small adjustment to her point of aim and settled in for her second sighting shot. This one hit closer to the center, and Sarah felt the familiar confidence that came when the rifle was talking to her clearly. She began her string of shots for score, taking her time between each shot to read the wind and ensure her position was consistent. Around her, she could hear the steady rhythm of other competitors firing their strings. Some were shooting much faster than she was, confident in their equipment's ability to deliver consistent results. Sarah continued at her own pace, trusting the process her grandfather had ingrained in her. When she finished her 10th shot, Sarah was surprised to realize she still had several minutes left on the clock. She had been so focused on each individual shot that she had lost track of time entirely. Looking through her scope at the target, she could see a group of holes clustered tightly around the center of the bullseye. As the electronic scoring system processed the targets, Sarah packed up her rifle and moved back to the staging area. She tried not to think about her score, focusing instead on the lessons her grandfather had taught her about competition. "Shoot your own match," he used to say. "Don't worry about what anyone else is doing. Just do your job, one shot at a time." The scores were posted on the monitors, and Sarah searched for her competitor number. When she found it, she had to look twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. Her group measured 0.847 inches center to center, with 9 of her 10 shots forming an even tighter cluster. Around her, she could hear surprised murmurs as other competitors noticed the score posted for the girl with the old rifle. Michael Torres walked over with a genuinely impressed expression. "That's some seriously good shooting," he said, extending his hand. "I may have underestimated that old Winchester of yours." Sarah shook his hand and smiled politely, but inside she felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with honoring her grandfather's memory. The first stage was complete, but she knew the real test was still ahead. At longer distances, every small error would be magnified, and the competition was just getting started. The break between the 100 and 200-yard stages gave competitors time to review their scores and adjust their equipment. Sarah found herself surrounded by curious shooters who wanted to get a closer look at the rifle that had just posted one of the top 10 scores of the morning. "What kind of ammunition are you shooting?" asked Jennifer Walsh, a competitive shooter from Dallas who had been dominating women's precision rifle competitions for several years. Her question was purely technical, the kind that serious shooters ask when they recognize genuine skill. "Handloads," Sarah replied. 175 grain Sierra Match King bullets over 43.5 grains of IMR 4064 powder. My grandfather worked up the load for this specific rifle about 10 years ago. Jennifer nodded appreciatively. Hand-loading ammunition was common among serious competitors, but most used sophisticated equipment and extensive testing to develop their loads. The fact that Sarah was shooting a decade-old load recipe with such precision suggested either incredible luck or a deep understanding of her equipment that went beyond normal preparation. "Mind if I ask what your grandfather's background was?" Jennifer continued. "He was a Marine sniper in Korea," Sarah said simply. "He taught me that consistency matters more than perfection." Word was beginning to spread among the competitors about the young woman with the old rifle who had posted a sub-minute of angle group at 100 yards. Captain Mitchell made his way over to where Sarah was preparing for the next stage. "How are you feeling about 200 yards?" he asked. "Confident," Sarah replied, and realized she genuinely meant it. "The wind is staying pretty consistent, and this rifle shoots well at that distance." The captain nodded and lowered his voice slightly. "You're getting some attention from the other competitors. Don't let it distract you from your process. Shoot your own match." It was almost exactly what her grandfather used to tell her, And hearing it from the captain reinforced her determination to stay focused on the fundamentals, rather than the growing audience of spectators who were beginning to take notice of the unfolding story. The 200-yard stage began with the same groups rotating through the firing line. Sarah was again in the third group, which continued to give her valuable time to observe conditions and watch how other shooters were adapting to the increased distance. The wind had picked up slightly, and the heat was creating more pronounced mirage effects that made reading conditions more challenging. Several shooters in the first group struggled with the changing conditions, and their scores reflected the increased difficulty. Sarah paid particular attention to how the wind was affecting bullet impact at the longer distance. What had been minor variations at 100 yards were now more significant, requiring more precise reading of conditions and timing of shots. When her own group was called to the line, Sarah noticed that several spectators had positioned themselves where they could observe her shooting position. The attention was flattering but also slightly nerve-wracking. She tried to block out the external distractions and focus on the routine her grandfather had taught her. Setting up at the 200-yard line, Sarah took more time with her first sighting shot. The distance required a different point of aim, and she wanted to ensure her scope adjustments were correct for the longer range. Her first shot hit slightly low and to the left, exactly where she had expected based on her previous practice at this distance. She made a small correction and fired her second sighting shot, which landed much closer to the point of aim. Satisfied with her zero, she began her string of record shots. The rhythm felt familiar, but everything was magnified at 200 yards. Small variations in position, breathing, or trigger control that might not have mattered at 100 yards became more significant. Sarah fell back on her grandfather's training, focusing intensely on each individual shot while maintaining awareness of the changing wind conditions. Halfway through her string, the wind shifted noticeably. Sarah paused, watching the mirage and the movement of grass near the target line. Her grandfather had taught her to be patient, to wait for the right conditions, rather than forcing shots when the wind was unfavorable. After about 30 seconds, the wind settled into a more consistent pattern, and Sarah resumed shooting. She could hear other competitors around her firing at a steady pace, but she maintained her deliberate approach. When she completed her 10th shot, Sarah felt good about the string but knew that any small errors would be more visible at the increased distance. She packed her equipment and moved back to the staging area, trying not to speculate about her performance. The electronic scoring system took longer to process the 200-yard targets due to the increased precision required in measurement. When the results were finally posted, Sarah's group measured 243 inches center to center, which at 200 yards represented approximately 0.6 minutes of angle. The score placed her in second place overall after 2 stages, behind only David Chen, a former Army marksman who was shooting a custom rifle that cost more than most people's cars. The murmuring among spectators and competitors was now clearly audible, and Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way that felt both exciting and slightly overwhelming. Michael Torres approached her again, this time with several other competitors in tow. "I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I made some assumptions about your equipment that were clearly wrong. That's some exceptional shooting." "The equipment doesn't matter as much as people think," Sarah replied, echoing something her grandfather had told her countless times. "It's about understanding what you have and working within its capabilities." One of the other competitors, a man Sarah had noticed earlier because of his elaborate setup and expensive gear, shook his head in amazement. "I've been trying to shoot groups like that for 3 years with every advantage money can buy. How long have you been competing?" "This is my first competition," Sarah admitted. The admission caused a moment of stunned silence among the small group that had gathered around her. First competition, old equipment, and currently sitting in second place overall with 1 stage remaining. Captain Mitchell appeared at the edge of the group and caught Sarah's attention. "Can I have a word with you privately?" he asked. They walked a short distance away from the crowd, and the captain's expression was serious but not unkind. "You realize what you've accomplished here today, don't you?" "I'm just shooting the way my grandfather taught me," Sarah replied honestly. "That's exactly my point," the captain said. "Your grandfather taught you something that most of these competitors have never learned, despite all their expensive equipment and years of practice. He taught you to shoot." The captain paused and looked toward the 300-yard firing line that would host the final stage. The next stage is going to be different. 300 yards will test everything you know about reading wind, managing your position, and maintaining concentration under pressure. Plus, everyone here is going to be watching to see if the girl with the old rifle can pull off what would honestly be considered a minor miracle in competitive shooting. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but it was accompanied by a surge of determination. What would my grandfather think about backing down from a challenge? Captain Mitchell smiled for the first time that day. I suspect he'd be proud of the shooter he trained, regardless of the outcome, but I also suspect he raised you not to give less than your best effort when it matters most. As they walked back toward the staging area, Sarah could see the 300-yard targets in the distance, looking impossibly small compared to the closer distances she had already conquered. The final stage would determine whether her performance had been a fluke or the result of training that went deeper than expensive equipment could provide. The lunch break before the final stage felt longer than it actually was. Sarah sat in the shade of her grandmother's pickup truck, eating one of Rosa's carefully packed sandwiches while trying to ignore the growing crowd of spectators who had heard about the unexpected performance by the girl with the vintage rifle. Word had spread beyond just the competitors. Range officials, local shooting enthusiasts, and even a reporter from a regional outdoor magazine had shown up to witness what was becoming an unlikely David and Goliath story in the world of precision rifle competition. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her grandmother. Mija, Mrs. Rodriguez called and said there's talk around town about you doing something special at the competition. Remember what your abuelo always said about staying calm when it matters most. I'm praying for you. The message brought a smile to Sarah's face and helped settle her nerves. Her grandfather had indeed taught her about managing pressure, though he had probably never imagined she would need those lessons in a formal competition setting. David Chen, the current overall leader, approached Sarah during the break. Unlike some of the earlier interactions, there was no condescension in his manner. He had clearly recognized that he was dealing with a serious competitor, regardless of her equipment. How are you feeling about 300 yards? He asked, settling into the shade beside her truck. Nervous, Sarah admitted honestly, but ready. David nodded. I've been competing for 15 years and I still get nervous before the long-range stuff. It's what keeps us sharp. He paused and glanced at her rifle case. Can I ask you something? That load you're shooting, has it been tested at 300 yards extensively? My grandfather and I used to shoot prairie dogs at that distance and beyond, Sarah replied. The rifle knows what to do at 300. It's just a matter of whether I can do my part. Prairie dogs, David repeated with a slight chuckle. That's actually better training than most formal long-range practice. Prairie dogs don't hold still, and they're a lot smaller than our targets. The conversation was interrupted by match director Dave Wilson's announcement that the final stage would begin in 15 minutes. Sarah gathered her equipment and began the mental preparation routine her grandfather had taught her for important shots. First, she reviewed her notebook entries about wind conditions and ammunition performance. Then she spent several minutes just breathing slowly and visualizing successful shots. Finally, she went through a mental checklist of all the technical elements she needed to execute properly. As the third group was called to the 300-yard line, Sarah noticed that the spectator area had filled significantly. Captain Mitchell was positioned where he could clearly observe the firing line, and she could see him speaking quietly with several other people who appeared to be experienced shooters. Based on their clothing and equipment, the wind conditions at 300 yards were noticeably different from the shorter distances. The increased distance meant that small variations in wind speed or direction would have much more dramatic effects on bullet impact. Sarah could see wind flags at various points downrange, and they weren't all pointing in exactly the same direction. Setting up at her assigned firing position, Sarah took extra time to study the conditions and plan her approach. At 300 yards, the target appeared much smaller through her grandfather's old scope, and she had to work harder to achieve the same level of precision in her sight picture. Her first sighting shot felt good, but it impacted about 2 inches low and 1 inch to the right of her point of aim. The impact was close to what she had expected based on her previous experience with this rifle at long range, but she needed to make adjustments to center her group for the record shots. The second sighting shot After adjustments hit much closer to her intended point of impact, Sarah felt the familiar confidence that came when the rifle was communicating clearly with her about what it needed to perform at its best. As she began her string of record shots, Sarah was acutely aware that this was the moment that would define her day, and possibly change how she thought about her own capabilities. The pressure was unlike anything she had experienced, but it was also strangely familiar. Her grandfather had taught her to embrace pressure as information, rather than as something to be feared. The first record shot broke cleanly and felt perfect. Through the scope, she could see the bullet hole appear in the 9 ring just slightly off-center. The second shot went into almost the same location, and Sarah began to feel the rhythm that her grandfather had called the zone. Shot after shot, the old Winchester delivered exactly what Sarah asked of it. The rifle's familiar recoil, the well-known feel of the trigger, and the sight picture through the vintage scope all combined into a shooting experience that felt almost automatic. Around her, she could hear other competitors firing their strings, but the sound seemed muted and distant. Her entire world had narrowed down to the fundamentals her grandfather had drilled into her: breathing, sight picture, trigger control, and follow-through. When she fired her 10th and final shot, Sarah knew immediately that it was the best shot of the string. The rifle's report, the feel of the recoil, and her sight picture at the moment of ignition all combined to give her the certainty that comes with a perfect shot. As she packed her equipment, Sarah realized that she had no idea how well she had actually performed. At 300 yards, it was impossible to see bullet holes clearly enough to judge group size or precise impact points. She would have to wait for the electronic scoring system to provide the measurements. The walk back to the staging area felt longer than usual, partly because she was exhausted from the intense concentration required for the long-range shooting, and partly because she was now acutely aware of the number of people watching her every move. Captain Mitchell intercepted her before she could find a place to sit down. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested significant news was coming. "How do you think you did?" he asked quietly. "It felt good," Sarah replied honestly. "The rifle was talking to me clearly, and I think I did my part. But I can't tell much about group size at that distance." The captain nodded and glanced toward the scoring area, where officials were processing the final targets. "The electronic system is taking a little longer than usual with the 300-yard measurements. Apparently some of the groups are small enough that they need extra precision in the measurement process." As they waited for the final scores, Sarah found herself surrounded by competitors and spectators who wanted to congratulate her on her performance regardless of the final outcome. She had clearly earned the respect of the shooting community through her demonstration of skill and composure under pressure. But Sarah knew that her grandfather would have been most proud, not of any scores or recognition, but of the fact that she had trusted her training and executed the fundamentals properly when it mattered most. Whatever the final results showed, she had honored his memory by shooting to the best of her ability with the tools he had given her. The electronic scoring system had been processing the 300-yard targets for nearly 20 minutes, which was unusual for equipment that typically provided results within 5 minutes of target submission. Match director Dave Wilson had made 2 announcements about technical delays, but offered no specific information about what was causing the holdup. Sarah sat in the shade, trying to stay hydrated and calm, while surrounded by an increasingly anxious crowd of competitors and spectators. The waiting was more stressful than the actual shooting had been, and she found herself replaying each shot in her mind, wondering if she had made some error that would cost her the competition. David Chen approached her during the delay, carrying 2 bottles of cold water from the concession stand. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering one to Sarah. "The waiting is always the worst part." "Thank you," Sarah replied gratefully. "Have you ever seen the scoring system take this long?" "Only once," David said, settling down beside her. 3 years ago, there was a group that measured so small they had to verify the measurement multiple times before they would post it. Turned out to be a new competition record. The comment made Sarah's stomach flutter with nervous energy. She tried not to read too much into David's words, but the implication was clear. Someone had shot an exceptionally small group, and the officials were taking extra time to ensure accuracy in their measurements. Captain Mitchell appeared from the direction of the scoring area, his expression carefully neutral, but with something in his bearing that suggested important news. He made his way directly to where Sarah was sitting, drawing the attention of everyone in the immediate area. "Sarah, could I have a word with you privately?" he asked. They walked a short distance away from the crowd, and the captain's professional demeanor gave way to something approaching amazement. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Have you ever shot a group smaller than half an inch at 300 yards? Sarah thought carefully before answering. "Once, maybe twice. My grandfather and I were working on a load development project, and we had a really calm day with perfect conditions. But those were carefully controlled situations, not in competition." Captain Mitchell nodded slowly. "What I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us until the official announcement. The scoring officials have measured your group 3 separate times using different equipment to verify the result." He paused, and Sarah could see other competitors beginning to notice their private conversation and speculating about what news was being shared. "Your 300-yard group measured 0.387 inches center to center. That's not just a personal best or even a match win. That's a new state record for this competition format, and it may be a new national record pending verification by the sanctioning body." Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The number didn't seem real, especially considering that she had achieved it with equipment that most of the other competitors had dismissed as inadequate for serious competition. "Are you sure?" she asked weakly. "I watched them measure it myself," the captain replied. "But here's the thing that makes this even more remarkable. Your combined score for all 3 distances isn't just good enough to win this competition. It's good enough to qualify you for the national championship, and it would have won last year's national championship outright." The implications of what the captain was telling her began to sink in slowly. She had not only proven that her grandfather's rifle and training methods could compete with modern equipment, she had demonstrated that they could exceed the performance of much more expensive and sophisticated gear. "There's something else," Captain Mitchell continued. "There are people here today who can help you take this to the next level if you're interested. Sponsors, coaches, opportunities to compete nationally. But first you need to decide if that's what you want." Sarah looked back toward the crowd of competitors and spectators, many of whom were clearly waiting for news about the delayed results. She thought about her grandfather and what he would have wanted for her. She thought about her college plans and the practical realities of her life in small-town Texas. "What would you do?" she asked the captain. "I'd remember that opportunities like this don't come along very often," he replied. "But I'd also remember that the most important thing is staying true to whatever made this possible in the first place. Your grandfather didn't teach you to shoot so you could become famous. He taught you to shoot because he saw something special in you." As they walked back toward the crowd, Sarah noticed that Dave Wilson was setting up the public address system for what appeared to be the final results announcement. The conversations around the staging area gradually quieted as competitors and spectators gathered to hear the official results. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during the extended scoring process," Dave began. "We had some exceptional shooting today that required additional verification before we could announce results." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the moment of truth approached. Regardless of what happened next, she knew that this day had already changed her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Before we announce the individual stage winners and overall placings, I want to note that we witnessed something truly special today. We had a new competitor achieve something that veteran shooters spend years trying to accomplish." Dave paused and looked directly at Sarah before continuing. "The final stage at 300 yards produced a group that not only sets a new range record, but appears to set a new state record for this type of competition. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with the overall winner and work our way through the placings." The crowd had grown completely silent, and Sarah could feel dozens of eyes focused on her. She tried to maintain her composure, but inside she felt a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and profound gratitude to her grandfather for the foundation he had given her. The overall winner of today's Lone Star Shooting Championship, with a combined score that represents truly exceptional marksmanship, is competitor number 47, Sarah Martinez. The announcement was followed by a moment of stunned silence, then by applause that started slowly but quickly grew into sustained cheering from the crowd of competitors and spectators who had witnessed something they would remember for years to come. The drive home felt surreal. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of her grandmother's pickup truck, staring at the trophy that was almost too large to fit comfortably in her lap. The gold engraving read, "Lone Star Shooting Championship Overall Winner," along with her name and the date. But the word still didn't feel completely real. Rosa glanced over at her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. Your abuela would have been so proud, mija. Not just of the winning, but of the way you carried yourself today. Sarah had called her grandmother immediately after the award ceremony, and Rosa had insisted on driving to the range to witness the conclusion of what had become a remarkable day. She had arrived just in time to see Sarah being interviewed by the reporter from the outdoor magazine and being approached by several people who represented equipment sponsors and shooting organizations. What are you going to do about all those offers? Rosa asked as they turned onto the highway that would take them back to their small town. During the hour after the results were announced, Sarah had been approached by representatives from 3 different rifle manufacturers, 2 scope companies, and an ammunition manufacturer. All were interested in sponsorship agreements that would provide free equipment in exchange for using their products in future competitions. There had also been an invitation to attend a national-level shooting school, an offer to join a competitive shooting team that traveled to matches across the country, and preliminary discussions about potential scholarship opportunities related to competitive shooting. I don't know yet, Sarah replied honestly. It's all happening so fast and I need time to think about what I really want. The most significant offer had come from Captain Mitchell, who had revealed that he was not just a spectator but a talent scout for a program that identified and developed promising young shooters for potential inclusion in national and international competitions. The shooting sports need people like you, he had told her during their final conversation of the day, not just because of your skill but because of your approach and your character. You represent something that's been getting lost in all the focus on equipment and technology. Sarah had promised to consider his offer seriously, but she had also made it clear that she needed to discuss any major decisions with her grandmother and think carefully about how competitive shooting might fit into her long-term plans. The local news had somehow gotten word of Sarah's victory, and when they arrived home, there were already 3 voicemail messages from reporters wanting interviews. The story of the small town girl who had won a major competition with her grandfather's old rifle was exactly the kind of human interest story that resonated with people far beyond the shooting sports community. That evening, Sarah sat on the back porch of her grandmother's house, cleaning her grandfather's rifle with the same care and attention she had always given it. The Winchester looked no different than it had that morning, but Sarah's relationship with it had been transformed by the day's events. Rosa joined her on the porch, bringing 2 glasses of iced tea and settling into her favorite chair. Tell me what you're really thinking about all this, she said gently. Sarah continued working on the rifle as she spoke. I keep thinking about what Abuelo used to say about shooting. He always told me it wasn't about the equipment or even about winning competitions. He said it was about discipline, focus, and respecting the traditions that came before us. And now, Rosa prompted. Now I'm wondering if maybe there's a way to honor those traditions while also taking advantage of the opportunities that are opening up. Maybe I can show people that the old ways still work, that you don't need the most expensive equipment to achieve something meaningful. Over the following days, Sarah's story began to spread beyond the local area. The outdoor magazine article titled "That Junk Still Runs, Vintage Rifle Delivers Record-Breaking Performance" was picked up by several national publications. Videos of Sarah's shooting technique, recorded by spectators at the competition, began circulating on social media. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many experienced shooters praising not just Sarah's marksmanship, but her attitude and approach to competition. Comments from viewers repeatedly noted how refreshing it was to see someone succeed through skill and preparation, rather than expensive equipment. 3 weeks after the competition, Sarah made her decision. She would accept Captain Mitchell's invitation to attend the National Shooting School, but only during summer breaks from college. She would also accept a modest sponsorship deal that would provide ammunition and some equipment, while allowing her to continue using her grandfather's rifle as her primary competition gun. I want to prove that the fundamentals still matter, she explained to the sponsor representatives. I want young shooters to understand that success comes from practice and dedication, not from having the most expensive gear. The compromise allowed Sarah to pursue her competitive shooting goals while staying true to the values her grandfather had instilled in her. She would attend college as planned, studying engineering with the practical goal of developing a career that could support her shooting activities. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the firing line at her first national championship, once again drawing curious glances and skeptical comments about her equipment. But this time, she also had supporters in the crowd who had followed her story and believed in what she represented. As she settled into position with her grandfather's rifle, Sarah could almost hear his voice reminding her of the fundamentals that had gotten her to this point. The rifle felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, like an old friend that had shared countless hours of practice and preparation. Looking through the vintage scope at the distant target, Sarah smiled slightly as she remembered the words Captain Mitchell had spoken after her record-breaking shot. Equipment doesn't make the marksman. The marksman makes the equipment. The lesson her grandfather had taught her about precision, coming from the heart and mind rather than from a price tag, was about to be tested on the biggest stage of her young shooting career. But Sarah felt ready, confident in the knowledge that some truths never go out of style, no matter how much the world around them might change.